everyone. Thank you for attending. This is our fourth session of the double ALS section on technology, law, and legal education 2022 summer webinar series. And the title of this presentation is Addressing Pandemic Technology in a Post-Pandemic World. And we have our wonderful presenter with us today, Sarah Starnes, and I'll give you a little bit more information about her in just a second. So I'm April Dawson. I am the chair of the double ALS section on technology, law, and legal education, and want to just go over a little bit of logistics. So we're trying to keep these webinars to about 45 minutes. So Sarah will be presenting for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A afterwards. If you have any questions, you can type your questions in the Q&A box. You don't have to wait until we get to Q&A. You can type in your questions whenever you want, and we'll make sure we get to those. This webinar is being recorded, and so hopefully at some point within the next couple of weeks, you'll have access to this webinar and all of the webinars in this series. All right, so that's it for logistics. Let me go ahead and introduce our presenter. So Sarah Starnes, she is an associate law librarian and an adjunct professor of legal writing at the University of Akron School of Law. Sarah teaches a variety of courses, including advanced legal research, legal analysis, research and writing, legal drafting, and technology in law. She is passionate about the growth of distance education in law schools and has created and currently teaches several asynchronous online courses. She has spoken at several conferences on the topic of distance education and tools to assist in making it better and making it a better experience for students. Sarah is also interested in the growth of technology and artificial intelligence in the legal field and how to best prepare students to utilize technologies available to them. So Sarah, thank you for being our speaker today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint and we'll get started. All right. Can everyone see my PowerPoint okay?
Looks great.
Awesome. Well, so as April so kindly introduced me, I am Sarah Starnes. I'm here in Akron, Ohio, and I'm going to be talking to you today about pandemic technology in a post-pandemic world. To start, I wanted to give you a brief roadmap of where I'm going to be going in the next 30 minutes or so. First, I'm going to be providing you an overview of the resulting technology use because of the pandemic, the return to normal, or what we would consider the new normal. And I say post-pandemic, I think we are still not out of the pandemic, but leading ourselves out of the pandemic. You know, we're not in it anymore, but we're also not completely separated from it. It's still a little visible in our rearview mirror. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, our shift to that return to what we would consider either a new normal or, you know, what things have newly accepted in the legal field. But because of that, because of the technology used during the pandemic, and then, you know, the shift to relying more on technology afterwards, there's some potential legal issues that have popped up. And this is just, I feel like, the tip of the iceberg. There's just a couple issues that I'm going to be talking about today that potentially will pop up as problems. I'm sure there will be much, much more. And because of that, I think we as educators need to be on the forefront of this, aware of what issues have resulted, what sort of things are happening in the court system, in the legal field, because our students are going out there and they're learning these, you know, they're having to like solve these problems that have then popped up as a result of this. And so for us to be ready, we are capable and prepared to then handle the questions when they come back to us, because they may not fully understand or know exactly what it is they're being asked to do. And so then I'll finish with, you know, how do we move forward and some suggestions to kind of help that preparation for the potential onslaught of questions. So to begin, the increase in technology use. So as we all know, March of 2020, people packed up and went home. There was places were closed everywhere, maybe skeleton shifts in other places, and not just firms and courtrooms and businesses, but law schools shut down too. And I think it's important to kind of mention the potential effect on the students, because then this is will affect how they view not just technology in the future, but how to address issues that have resulted because of the increase in technology use of from the pandemic. So, they may have done some online classes before the pandemic. I know I taught a couple asynchronous courses, but when everything closed down, it was 100% online just like that. And so we as faculty had to figure out, how do we keep the students engaged? And so we had to create on the fly different methods of creating online classrooms using, Brightspace, Blackboard, Canvas. We were using things such as Panopto, WebEx, Teams, things like digital whiteboards, because we wanted to make sure that the students, despite not being in the building, were still receiving the same level of education. And so you'll see things like the cool tools that happened before, programs that happened before the pandemic, that options that could be incorporated were now then required in order to keep the students engaged. Courtrooms, something very similar happened. They all shut down, and then they had to quickly decide, how are remote proceedings going to be possible? You want to protect the public health, but you also need to make sure that you're serving communities and making sure that it's efficient and fair. And so pretty much by March, April, nearly every court in the country had some form of remote proceedings happening. There were a couple challenges with this, Zoom court. I'm sure we've all seen the video of the guy who's like, I'm a cat. And, proceedings were not happening at that point because somehow he turned into a cat and he couldn't turn it off. And so, there are some challenges, but it was easier with civil proceedings, things like bail hearings, plea hearings, sentencings, eviction proceedings, family court, things like that. It was a little easier. So it quickly shifted online in a much faster fashion. Texas, for example, had never held a remote hearing before, and between March 2020 and April of 2021, held 1.1 million remote hearings, which is an incredible amount considering that things started from zero just a couple years ago. Michigan, I feel like, is kind of the leader in terms of remote court or Zoom court. Between March and September of 2020, nearly 1,000 judges presided over 800,000 hours of proceedings. They had already started to put virtual proceedings in place prior to the pandemic. So it was much easier for them because they didn't necessarily have to get the technology and learn the technology. It was already somewhat in place. Criminal court was a little harder just because the Constitution demands the right to face your witnesses or face your accuser or, whatever it may be. And so courts then delayed jury trials and in-person hearings. And it struggled because then you are trying to figure out, how do you keep the wheels of justice moving while not being able to adhere to constitutional requirements. Some courts did, with and without permission from defendants, choose to do some form of virtual court. But in order to make sure that things were okay in criminal cases, they had to consider things like, was it a really complex case? Is it a time-sensitive case? Is a person incarcerated? Is it a self-represented litigant? And so things like that had to be taken into consideration as to whether or not this Zoom court could happen. E-filing also boomed. So roughly 37 states prior to the pandemic allowed for e-filing from not just attorneys, but then also the public. After the pandemic, that has jumped up to almost all 50 states, and they have streamlined and made the process easier for self-represented litigants and individuals to understand what the filing process is and how to do it online. We also need to look at remote actions such as notarizing documents and witnessing documents such as wills. These are a little harder because there are a lot of statutes in place that require these things to happen in person. And so remote notarization really boomed. Most states started to allow some form of electronic notarization. Some states created like temporary health orders or, delayed, or gave alternate options for witnessing, especially for wills. But not all states did. But we know that these still went on despite the fact that it may not have been covered or it may have been against a state statute. So as I said, we are passing through the pandemic. It's not out of the rearview mirror, but we're working on it. And so there's this new normal, this return to normal. Most states had the virtual court. Most states have retained some form of remote proceedings, local jurisdictions, big, appellate courts, et cetera. Everybody in some way has kind of kept the option available for remote court. Firms and schools have also remained a little more flexible in terms of working arrangement, hours worked, and where they're working. The big thing in courtrooms, though, is, people really struggled when things started opening back up because you didn't know, was it live? Was it remote? Did you need to show up? Did you need to request something? And it differed from court to court and sometimes from judge to judge. So, one judge in the same court could be completely different than another judge in the same courthouse. And so it was really hard to figure out how to adjust to that and how to handle, making sure that proceedings still continued efficiently and properly. So a couple examples: Florida actually suspended all court rules eliminating or prohibiting the use of remote proceedings. Texas pretty much said anyone can participate remotely as long as it's reasonable. And of course, Michigan, I think leader in all of this, actually created an administrative order that said a return to full capacity does include virtual proceedings. And so they will continue to expand the use of remote participation. Any reasonable request must be given to attend remotely. Some people may attend remotely while others attend live, but they have decided that their return to normal, their full capacity going forward will and should and will and almost is required to include some sort of virtual component. Jury trials picked back up with a couple changes. You usually have a right to view, public access to view the proceedings. However, sometimes they're now optioning to provide it via video or live stream. So you as a viewer don't have to be in the room. They're relaxing requirements, so some people can be a witness via video rather than having to travel to then show up and provide their witness statement. And then in some cases, they're also allowing remote jury selection. And so then that way there's not a big group of people coming in, they do it all online, and then just the jury will show up. In office, there's kind of two ends of the spectrum. I feel like, some people are like, back in the office 100%. Other people are like, let's stay remote, it works great. There are some helpful things like, now you can do remote depositions. You don't have to travel across the country to do that. And there are other helpful things such as, cloud-based technologies. It was growing significantly before the pandemic, but I think it really just cemented its place in the legal field that it is the way of the future, because people didn't have to use VPN. They can access anything from anywhere. And it really highlighted how helpful using a cloud-based technology with a single practice management system like Clio can be, because everything is streamlined, everything is in one place, and it's easy to work from any location. Law schools, when we shut down, we shut down. They were, everything was online. We received variances in order to continue that so students could continue to get their education. But typically, now that the pandemic is slowly receding, some variances have ended. And so students can typically take up to 1/3 of their total credit hours online. A lot of schools before the pandemic probably weren't taking full advantage of the ability to offer up, enough classes to get up to that 1/3%. And I think after the pandemic, a lot of law schools have kept the online classes that they've created as a result of the pandemic. So the balancing act of, live versus remote proceedings, courts have a lot that they have to take into consideration, in order to keep using the technology. They want it to be fair, transparent, provide access to everybody. They want to make sure that they are adapting statutes and rules so the technology use can continue. They want to make sure that the e-filing and the forms are easily accessible. People understand how to enter and access the data. They're making sure that they're accessible, that those even with disabilities can utilize these electronic processes. They want to make sure that there's flexibility in providing these, remote options. So then that way, if something does go wrong, there is the ability to pause or to start over or to, end there and restart another day. It may be live and in person. And so it's very important that the courts use the technology to their advantage, but also understand its limitations. And then, like I said, with law schools, a lot of classes may remain online. There may be more synchronous options. There may be more asynchronous options. There may be the ability to have a live course with an option to, virtually attend. I think that it's important to keep that flexibility in law schools, because once the students are out working externships, clerkships, even after graduation, they're going to be seeing some sort of flexible work arrangement. And so they need to be, familiar and understand how to use some of those technologies before they enter the workforce. Another super awesome thing that I think is happening is in moot court and trial advocacy competitions. They were totally online during the pandemic. Now there's some that are online, there are some that are in person. And I think it's great because it opens up the opportunity for more participation. Some people may only have the budget to go to 1 or 2 competitions. Well, now maybe they can attend 3 because they can attend 1 online. So some likely legal issues that have resulted from the increase in technology. And this, I would just like to say, is a start. This is stuff that I'm seeing, but I know there is more out there. I know more is coming. I think it's just, the further away we get from the pandemic, the more that it's going to pop up. So just, keep this in mind that this is just, I feel like, the start. But the biggest one resulting from increased usage of technology is access to justice. Like how do people with disabilities use the technology? They may be prevented from using certain technologies. What about, certain, people who are don't have good housing, aren't stable, those who, maybe don't have the funds to purchase high-end technology or consistent and stable internet. And so it's important to make sure that even though we are continuing to use these technologies, that it's accessible to everyone. Another big potential issue here is remote interpreter services, making sure that you're finding someone that can appropriately interpret the situation. And it may be more difficult communicating over online when, there are, several parties on several screens, the interpreter is somewhere else, the individual is, in another location, and trying to communicate may inhibit certain successes because, and, transferring of information. Courts also need to be sure to properly fix any issues that may pop up. And so then that way they don't end something early, they make a quick decision because something is starting to go wrong. At the same time though, like in a way it's almost increased access to justice because it's made it more available for people. Just because since people can attend things online now, a lot of hearings where someone may not be able to show up, they're now showing up. And so they are attending more things, and more things are taking longer because they have the ability to be there for the hearing. There's also the decrease and increase in litigation as a result of the pandemic. The big thing is the delays, especially in criminal cases, in jury trials, things stopped. They really didn't happen. A couple places did, there were a few things, but for the most part, things were delayed. And that can have a huge effect on individuals who are, incarcerated or waiting to get out or waiting to be sentenced. And so these delays can affect, their constitutional rights, and how do then they solve those issues? Some courts against consent of the defendant did video, some with consent did video, but what are the potential repercussions of some of these things? We also have to make sure that there's no issues and delays with jury, because it's going to be harder to keep a jury online. It's going to be harder to monitor them, sequester them. You also have to be careful that, things are recorded. If they're recorded, they're out there on the internet. This is never going away. My video will be available from somebody potentially forever. And so the same thing goes potentially with recorded court proceedings. And sometimes things are sealed. How do you record something, but then take it back later? You can't. And so there's a lot of potential there for resulting issues. And then backlog, some courts saw about a 5% increase in backlogs. It helped with civil cases that they moved online, criminal cases, not so much. But they're working on trying to decrease that backlog. And so, some states are, dropping cases. Some people are doing early release. Some are prioritizing repeat offenders. They're pulling judges out of retirement, trying to figure out how to catch up on this backlog. But by trying to catch up and by trying to speed through these, what are they missing? What things could pop up as a result of this attempt to be super efficient? They also have to make sure that in this attempt to be efficient and to catch up on this backlog, that they're still informing individuals of how things work. If you attend Zoom court, especially like a self-represented litigant, they need to make sure they understand where they need to go on the internet, what links they need to click on, how it works, the mute button, the video button, so many different options. And so that can potentially cause issues when they're not aware of how the technology works as well. And then communication, especially between clients and attorneys. So not so much, before or even after any sort of court proceeding, but, during court proceedings, especially if it's happening online, you don't have that like one-on-one like whisper that you can have when you're live and in person. It's harder for the defendant to ask questions. It is harder for the attorney to confirm something. There's no way to have like a secret one-on-one discussion because everybody's in the room, everybody can hear everything. And so we may see some increase in ineffective assistance of counsel because defendants aren't feeling like they're receiving the correct representation because of their inability to communicate during legal proceedings with their attorney. Also, there are certain technologies that are incompatible with current laws. So I briefly mentioned it earlier. Before the pandemic, only 4 states allowed remote witnessing. It's now up to 7. There were probably about 6 or 7 more states that had emergency health orders or something like that then allowed for it. But for the most part, it is against the law to do remote witnessing. And so how do they address that now? Because during the pandemic, there was no choice. I briefly mentioned this earlier, but also video appearances, requiring a defendant to appear by video against their consent, that may cause some constitutional issues. And so it's very apparent that we need to make sure that whatever technology use is, that what happened during the pandemic, if it's against the law, we figure out how we can then potentially solve those issues. And so moving into that, it's so important that we're ready, because the students are going to be entering the workforce. They're going to be, doing summer clerkships, externships, graduating, working in firms. And so we want to be sure that they are confident in whatever questions may come at them. And so they understand the types of things, the types of problems that may pop up, which potentially they may never have gotten prior to the pandemic. They may be some new non-typical issues that that pop up that don't have an easy answer, especially in the first year of law school. Students are taught cases, statutes, secondary sources, maybe some regulations and legislative history, but they're not taught other less formal ways of research. They're also taught that a lot of times there is an answer. And now there may not be answers yet. Things are still happening. I'm starting to receive questions, which is what kind of sparked this presentation, about how do we handle that? How do we help the students when they come to us with these problems? I had a student who worked for a small firm doing wills and trust work. And a will was done peak pandemic with a terminally ill patient. And there was absolutely no way there could be witnesses or a notary there because of how ill he was. And so even though it's directly against Ohio statute, they did the will. After the gentleman passed, the will is now being contested because it was done remotely. However, the thing is there was no other way to do it. It's totally unforeseen that the pandemic was happening. So is there going to be any leeway in the law to adjust for these unforeseen circumstances? I had another student work for a small municipal court, and there was a last minute request to appear by Zoom, not for medical reasons. They just didn't want to show up. They wanted to show up by video. And the court denied it. The person didn't end up showing up then. But the student was curious, like, how do you tell then when to, allow for a request to appear by Zoom, and when do you deny it? And so, I think we really need to be creative and teach our students to think outside of the box. There are a ton of websites that have collected court rules, emergency health orders. Have the students find those and look at those. What power do these emergency health orders have? Was there any legislation afterwards that decreased the power of an emergency health order? Was that retroactive? Is it only going forward? What sort of guidelines existed during the pandemic? Did they expire? When did they expire? How do you choose when to continue something when it's in direct contrast to the law? And so I think we need to show these students that there are other ways to find answers to these problems. And the thing is they may not have a correct answer. It may be a suggested answer. I think it's very important that we increase education in dockets earlier, just because a lot of this is going through right now. Things are happening as we speak. There's not maybe a lot of opinions out there on it yet. And so to be able to teach the students to work with dockets, they may be able to see trends or patterns, or, pulling from what cases in their jurisdiction have been deciding as persuasive authority to help answer the questions that they've been asked in their work. So what's next? What can we do? We are passing the pandemic, but things aren't over. So we need to make sure that we as educators are prepared to help the students when they come to us with questions, be creative in how we help them find their answers in different sources that may not be typically or first thought of. And then I think we need to be open and willing to change what we teach and how we teach. I think this is going to change the legal field for years to come. And I think it's so important that we adjust for that and prepare the students for that, so they're not completely thrown off their game when they're sent out into the world to practice. I plan on adding a little more docket information into my first year legal research course. I'm considering creating some sort of advanced legal research course, something that teaches, alternative methods. I don't know what that is yet, but I think it's something that we all need to be thinking about. And I think it's something that the students will appreciate, that when they come to us, we're available then to answer those questions. And with that, that is all from me. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask now, I guess, or my contact information is up on the screen. Feel free to jot that down, send me an email, call me, whatever that may be. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. So Jenny Broats actually put a link in the chat to the California Guide on Best Practices for Remote Court Proceedings. And she has a question if you recommend any others. And I just kind of pulled that up. And yeah, this is a great resource. Thank you, Jenny.
Yes. So the what is it? The National State Court website has actually collected all of the best practices, and they've put together their own guidelines as well to suggest then to other state courts of how to, these how-to guides. There's also, I'm totally blanking on the website now. I can provide it to you if you're interested, but there's a website that has collected all of these guidelines into one place. So you essentially click on the state and it will, provide you with what sort of guides are out there in each specific state.
Excellent. Thank you. And if you all have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Sarah, I did have some questions, so I'll go ahead and get us
Of course.
Started off here. So I really appreciated your kind of emphasizing that we as educators, we need to be prepared. And we can't be prepared and we can't answer those questions that the students will inevitably have if we don't even know what's going on in this space. So I appreciate you kind of sharing, what's happened, pandemic, post-pandemic, or as we're moving out of the pandemic, in not just the legal education space, but also in like the real world, because we as legal educators, we can be siloed. And those of us who talk a lot about how legal education needs to change, we lament the fact that so many of us teach the way we were taught, and that was decades ago, right? And so my question to you is, other than, kind of encouraging or insisting that people join this fabulous section of AALS, what other suggestions do you have to bring other legal educators into the fold about the importance of really knowing what's going on in the real world, so we can be responsive to our students and better prepare them for real world practice, as opposed to preparing them for the practice of law that existed when I was in law school almost 30 years ago?
So I think we need to practice what we preach a little bit. We always tell the students, especially, those writing papers, check the legal news, check Lexis, check Bloomberg. Bloomberg has hot topics. They have these practice guides, and those are constantly being updated by people, experts in the field. And I think sometimes we teach the students how to use those. We don't necessarily always use them ourselves. And so I think it's so important that we actually do the research ourselves, and we are consistent in, checking what's going on and keeping, a pulse on what's happening outside of the law school bubble.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that. Great suggestion. And let's see, I'm checking the questions. Okay, let's see. There's one in the chat. Let's see here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Corin, yeah, included the link to, is that the site you were talking about?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Corin. And let's see, I had a couple of other questions. So while we're waiting for other folks, I will just keep going.
Okay.
So let's see. So you talked about this. You talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to know if you could expand. You were talking about both in the law school context and also kind of in the court context. These were technologies and approaches that were used in the pandemic that we're seeing continue. And so in the law school space, you were talking about, all of us had to shift to, online teaching, either synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid. And you emphasized that a lot of those formats are going to continue, even if you have law schools that don't have like an ABA approved kind of online program. Other than like the synchronous and asynchronous classes, do you see any other approaches that law schools took in order to respond to the pandemic that you anticipate will continue?
I don't really know. You threw me off with the question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just utilizing different ways to keep students engaged. We had a lot of, casual virtual meetups. We, met outside in our little bubbles. And so we were still together, but it was, it's not a technology, but we were able to, talk to the students and connect with them. I think a lot of the different tools that are out there are also very helpful. The interactive whiteboards, flip boards, those kind of like Google Docs group editing documents, things like that, that help keep, students engaged outside of the kind of typical, either synchronous or just asynchronous course. For example, and I don't know, maybe this is or isn't relevant. One of our professors here held a completely open non-credit course that anybody could attend. And so it was really interesting to see how many registrants were both in the law school and outside of the law school that signed up to take this course. And, there was no homework, there was no reading. It was just, I think, like an 8-week series where he spoke about social justice. And so it was very well attended. He hopes to do it again. And I think it's a different way outside of requiring credits to learn about an important subject.
Yeah, I think those are excellent examples. And as you were talking about like the casual meetups and when we think about community building, one of the things that I did appreciate about the kind of the remote world is you were forced to think very intentionally about building community. Whereas in the face-to-face space, you may have thought about it, but well, maybe I'll just speak for myself. I wasn't quite as intentional about it. I just assumed that community would occur, which it did, but it probably could have occurred better if I had been intentional, even in the face-to-face space. So kind of thinking about the tools, one of the things that I used that I really liked, but probably would not have had we not been remote, was Flipgrid, which is, an application where you can record these short little videos. And so in terms of my students introducing themselves and having them, maybe listen to a podcast that was relevant to a case and then giving their reaction to that on the Flipgrid, like that kind of goes to your point about these tools that provided great benefit during that time period and that they can continue to provide benefits even if we go back to face-to-face. You mentioned your colleague who had this non-credit course, and it reminded me of this professor whose class was actually face-to-face in the spring, but she invited guest speakers to attend remotely, and she opened it up to the legal community to, or at least the legal academy, if we wanted to join to hear the speaker. So we weren't participating in the class, but because it was remote. And that's another kind of example similar to the one that you noted. And I think you're right. Those are things that it would be good to see them continue because they do add a lot of value.
I think too, it's also an opportunity for more formative assessment. So something I started during the pandemic is live writing sessions where I would watch a student write. They could ask me questions as they did it. I would provide feedback, and then it was volunteer basis, so I only had a few. I'm considering making it a requirement in the future, but something else I required was live feedback sessions. So rather than grading their materials and giving it back to them with my comments, we went through it together. I added the comments as I'm talking to the person. They're able to provide their thoughts to me, why they did what they did. Oh, I see why I made the mistake. I see where I missed this. And the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive that it's actually easier done online because you're sharing your screen. You can see the comments. You're not crowded around, one, screen by itself. And the students love it. They get so much more out of it than just seeing a grade at the bottom and maybe they skim through the comments.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Would you record those sessions as well?
Yes.
Yeah, which then, then they can go back and they're like, I remember, professor said so-and-so. And so to be able to pull up that recording. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, excellent. Let's see, just keep checking the questions. Okay, let's see. So I did have one other thought as you were talking about how we need to, as educators, kind of help our students understand how to look at trends and patterns. And it made me think, of course, about legal analytics, which is something that is big in the real world. We don't talk about it nearly as much in the legal education space, but as you were talking about that, like teaching our students how to, when they go out there, to think about those things. Did you have any thoughts about how we can do a better job when it comes to data and how data is being crunched and exposing our students to tools that may be out there, either in terms of having access to the data or the algorithms, and just what are your thoughts about that space?
So the way we teach advanced legal research is module based. And so we have different modules with different subjects. And we've been discussing how can we create a module of analytics that introduces them to it in such a way that is accessible and understandable, but then also sparks their interest that they will continue to investigate it on their own. And I think it's something that we can discuss more in class. I would love if they could discuss it more in the doctrinal courses and the experiential courses. I always make sure to mention to look at that if I'm ever given the opportunity to guest lecture in a course. And so I think just, keeping with it and making sure that we are consistently encouraging that discussion. And my hope is, and maybe I'm being too positive here, that the students, their interest will be sparked and they will pursue it more on their own. I think especially after they go out into the world and they see it in practice, it definitely, even after their first or second year of law school, I think it gives them a different perspective and the ability to really appreciate and understand more how these analytics work, how to identify trends, how to follow them and make decisions based off of that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, that's great. All right, so I was just checking. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but you've provided such great, answers to my questions. I really appreciate what you've shared with us. I think it's getting all of us kind of thinking about how we can take that experience and grow and continue to learn from it and be better educators and do, a better job of preparing our students for the real practice of law and not what it was when we were graduating or what we think it is, what it actually is. So Sarah Starnes, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who have attended this webinar. Again, if you want to review it or if you want to share it with your colleagues, It will be recorded. You'll have access to this webinar and all of the webinars in this series on the section's webpage. If you're not a member of the section, we'd like to invite you to join the section. We've got fabulous content like what Sarah shared with us today, and just all throughout the year. So with that, we'll go ahead and call it. But again, Sarah, thank you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Have a great one, guys.